The moment I understood came during dessert. We were sitting at my father's table, the long mahogany one he'd imported from somewhere expensive, and Elena's laugh had that new quality to it. Too bright, too practiced. She was telling him about the gallery opening she wanted to curate, her hand moving through the air like she was conducting an orchestra, only they could hear. I'd heard this story before. In our apartment 3 weeks ago, curled on our second-hand couch with her head on my chest. Back then it had been our dream. Now it was her pitch. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling a scotch. The crystal caught the light from the chandelier overhead. Everything in this house caught the light. Ambitious, he said, and the word landed between compliment and test. You'd need capital. Real capital, not good intentions. I know. Elena's voice softened, became almost confessional. I've learned that timing matters. And partnerships. She didn't look at me when she said it. The housekeeper cleared our plates with the silent efficiency my father demanded. I watched Elena's fingers trace the stem of her wine glass, the same fingers that had traced my jawline that morning, promising we'd tell him together that we were moving to Portland, that I'd accepted the teaching position, that we were building something honest and ours. My son thinks love conquers all. My father smiled when he said it the way you smile at a child's drawing. He's always been idealistic. It's charming, really. But the world doesn't reward charm. No, Elena agreed quietly. It doesn't. I set down my fork. The small sound felt enormous in the silence that followed. My father stood, walked to the window, overlooking his manicured grounds. The sprinklers had started their evening cycle, mathematical and precise. I'm expanding the foundation board, he said to the glass, looking for someone with vision, someone who understands how money creates meaning. He turned then and looked directly at Elena. The salary would be considerable, the connections invaluable. Her breath caught. I heard it. Of course, my father continued, it would require commitment, relocation, trust. His eyes flicked to me, just for a second, loyalty to the family. The choice hung in the air like smoke. Elena's hand found mine under the table. Her fingers were cold. She squeezed once, an apology or a goodbye, I couldn't tell, then let go. I'd be honored, she said. The words were soft, but they shattered something in my chest I hadn't known could break. Not because I'd lost her to my father, but because I finally understood. I had never been enough. Not me, not what we'd built in that cramped apartment with its broken heating and hopeful mornings. None of it had ever weighed more than this. A desk, a title, access to rooms I'd spent my whole life leaving. My father raised his glass. To new partnerships. Elena lifted hers. They clinked crystal together, and the sound was delicate and final. I stood, without a word, walked out of that dining room, and heard her voice behind me calling my name. Once. Then silence. That night, I stopped trying to be someone worth buying. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. Instead, I drove to the coast 3 hours in silence with the window cracked, just enough to let the cold air keep me sharp. The highway was empty, and somewhere around midnight, I pulled into a rest stop and sat in the parking lot watching trucks idle under fluorescent lights. Their engines rumbled like breathing. I envied them, the clarity of simply moving forward, carrying weight from one place to another without questioning why. My phone vibrated 7 times before I turned it off. By morning, I was standing on a beach I'd visited once as a child before my mother left, when my father still pretended happiness was something worth purchasing. The water was gray and relentless. I remembered building sandcastles here, watching them dissolve under the tide, learning early that nothing you make by hand survives contact with something larger than yourself. Elena had taught me to believe otherwise, or I'd let myself believe she had. When I finally returned to the city 2 days later, the apartment felt like a crime scene. Her coffee mug still sat on the counter, lipstick print on the rim. The book she'd been reading, some novel about women and choices and consequences, lay open on the couch, spine cracked at page 211. I closed it carefully and set it on the table. I packed methodically. Clothes, books, the few things that had been mine before us. I left everything we'd chosen together, the prints from the flea market, the lamp we'd argued about, the cast iron pan we'd seasoned like it was a ritual. Let her explain their absence to my father. Let her decide what they were worth. The landlord was sympathetic when I broke the lease. Happens more than you'd think, he said, not unkindly. People change their minds about what they want. I didn't correct him. She hadn't changed her mind. She'd simply shown me what it had always been. I found a studio across town, fourth-floor walk-up, in a building that smelled like curry and old wood. One room, kitchenette, a window that faced a brick wall. It was honest in its limitations. I could work with that. The first week, I did nothing but read. My father's business journals, investor reports, the kind of dry material I'd always dismissed as the language of people who'd forgotten how to feel. But I read them differently now, not with contempt, but with attention. I began to see the patterns, how money moved like water, how power accumulated in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. My father had built an empire on understanding want. He could see it in people the way a jeweler sees flaws in stone. He'd seen it in Elena the moment I'd brought her to that first dinner, when she'd complimented his Rothko and asked intelligent questions about his foundation's mission. I'd thought she was being polite. He'd known she was auditioning. On the 8th day, Elena called from a new number. I let it ring. She called again an hour later, then again that evening. The third time I answered. Please, she said. Just that one word, and I could hear the apartment behind her. Our apartment, now hers alone, or maybe already his. Can we talk? We did talk, I said quietly. At dinner. You were very clear. That's not fair. You don't understand the position I was in. I understand exactly. My voice stayed level, almost gentle. You had a choice between what we were building and what he was offering. You chose the one that came with a salary. The silence stretched between us like a wire. I loved you, she finally said, and the past tense was everything. I know, I replied, but not more than you loved the idea of never struggling again. I hung up before she could respond. My hand didn't shake. That was when I realized something had changed, not broken, but crystallized. The hurt was still there, but it had transformed into something colder and more useful. Understanding. I spent the next 2 weeks in my father's world, not as his son, but as a student. I attended the charity galas I'd always avoided, stood in corners, and watched how money changed hands, how promises were made in the spaces between handshakes and laughter. I saw Elena there once, across a ballroom, wearing a dress that cost more than our monthly rent used to. She looked beautiful and expensive and slightly desperate. She saw me too, started to approach. I turned and walked away, not quickly, just away, like she was scenery. I wasn't ready yet. Not for confrontation, not for revenge. I was still in the phase of learning the rules of a game I'd refused to play my entire life. But I was learning fast, and somewhere in those cold, quiet weeks, as I rebuilt myself in that sparse studio with its view of nothing, I began to understand something my father had always known. The people who hurt you always assume you'll come back. They count on your need for closure, for explanation, for one more chance to be seen. I had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. 3 months after the dinner, I enrolled in business school, not at some prestigious institution where my father's name would open doors, but at a state university downtown where the students worked full-time and attended classes at night. The building smelled like burned coffee and ambition. Everyone there was hungry in a way I recognized now, not for luxury, but for leverage. I sat in the back and took notes like my life depended on it. Corporate finance, contract law, strategic management. The professors spoke in a language I'd spent years dismissing as soulless, but I understood now that language was simply a tool, and I'd been bringing philosophy to a negotiation my entire life, wondering why I kept losing. My father's lawyers had always intimidated me with their precision, the way they could turn affection into clauses and loyalty into terms. Now, I studied their methods like a dialect. I learned how trusts worked, how assets could be protected or exposed, how empires were built on structures invisible to people who thought love was enough. I stopped posting on social media, stopped accepting invitations to events where I might run into Elena or my father's circle. I became a ghost in my own life, present only in classrooms and the library and my studio where I worked late into the night. The first time I saw my father after the retreat was at a university fundraising event. He was the keynote speaker, talking about legacy and responsibility in that smooth baritone that had convinced hundreds of people to part with millions. I sat in the middle of the auditorium, not hiding but not announcing myself either. Elena was there too, in the front row, dressed in that careful way that screamed expensive taste meeting old money approval. She'd lost weight. Her smile had that brittle quality I'd seen on my father's previous acquisitions, the ones who'd learned too late that proximity to power isn't the same as possessing it. I didn't stay for the reception, but I made sure to walk past Elena on my way out, close enough that she'd have to see me, far enough that I couldn't be stopped. Her hand reached out, an instinct, maybe a reflex, but I was already past her. In the lobby, I ran into Robert Chin, my father's CFO. We'd met at family dinners over the years, though he'd always treated me with the benign dismissal reserved for decorative relatives. "Surprised to see you here," he said. Studying business, I replied simply, "Your keynote at the finance symposium last year was instructive." Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration. We talked for 20 minutes about portfolio diversification and risk management. By the end, he'd handed me his card. "We're always looking for bright analysts. Give me a call if you're interested." I thanked him and left. I wouldn't call, not yet, but I planted something, a seed of doubt about who I was, who I might become. The real shift came during a family law seminar. The professor was discussing fiduciary duty, how family wealth could be protected or weaponized through careful structuring. "The law assumes good faith," she said, "but good faith is remarkably easy to simulate. Documentation matters more than intention. What you can prove matters more than what you feel." I thought about my father's foundation, the board position he'd offered Elena, the careful way he'd structured everything to look like opportunity while functioning as a leash. And I realized he'd taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. He'd shown me exactly how he thought, how he moved, where he was vulnerable. Every empire has a structure, and every structure has a weakness. I started requesting public filings, foundation reports, corporate registrations, the kind of information that was technically available but that nobody bothered to read. I wasn't looking for scandal. I was looking for patterns, for the gap between what my father claimed his empire stood for and how it actually functioned. I found inconsistencies, small ones, probably legal, definitely ethical gray areas, the kind of things that wouldn't matter unless someone who understood both the business and the family was paying attention. Elena texted me once during this period, 3 a.m. "I miss who we were." I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. By the end of the semester, I'd earned straight A's and a reputation among the professors as someone serious. One evening, driving home, I passed my father's estate. The gates were closed, the grounds lit up like a stage set. I could see figures moving behind the windows, probably a dinner party, probably Elena playing hostess. I didn't feel anger anymore, just clarity. They thought they'd won. They thought I'd broken, disappeared, become another cautionary tale about idealism meeting reality. They were waiting for me to come back, humbled and ready to accept whatever scraps of belonging they might offer. They had no idea I was building something they couldn't buy, not revenge, something better. The first crack appeared in a newspaper I wasn't even reading for that purpose. I was at a coffee shop near campus, reviewing case studies, when I saw the headline buried on page 6 of the business section, "Whitmore Foundation, under review for grant irregularities." My father's foundation. A routine audit, the article said. Nothing alarming. Just questions about allocation processes and beneficiary selection. I read it 3 times, searching between the lines for what wasn't being said. By that evening, the story had metastasized online. Anonymous sources suggesting conflicts of interest, board members declining to comment, my father's PR team issuing carefully worded statements about full cooperation and standard procedures, the kind of language that sounded reassuring until you realized it didn't actually deny anything. I didn't call, didn't reach out. I simply watched. 2 weeks later, a former employee filed a whistleblower complaint. The details were technical misappropriation of funds, nepotistic hiring practices, grants awarded to organizations with suspicious ties to board members. Nothing criminal, probably, but enough to stain the reputation my father had spent decades polishing. Elena's name appeared in the third paragraph. Recently appointed to the board. No allegations of wrongdoing, but questions about her qualifications, her relationship to the family, whether she'd been hired for expertise or other reasons. I imagined her reading that article. The way her hands would tremble slightly, the way she'd refresh the page, hoping the words would change. I'd seen her do that with bad reviews of gallery shows, back when we dreamed small dreams together. My phone rang. My father's number. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more that week. Then stopped. Pride, probably. Or strategy. He'd always believed silence was a form of leverage, that whoever needed the conversation, more would eventually break. But I'd learned that from him too. The investigation moved slowly, the way institutional failures always do. Lawyers got involved. Depositions were scheduled. The local media picked up the story, then the regional outlets. Nothing explosive, just a steady drip of implications and corrections and anonymous sources saying things that couldn't quite be proven, but couldn't quite be dismissed. I ran into Marcus at the library one night. He slid into the chair across from me, nodded at the article I'd pulled up on my laptop. "That's your father's foundation," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "You knew this was coming." I closed the laptop carefully. I knew the structure was vulnerable. I didn't know when or how it would matter. Marcus studied me with that expression he got when he was working through a legal problem. There's knowing something's wrong and there's doing something about it. Which one are you? I'm the one who stopped pretending ignorance was innocence. He nodded slowly, gathered his books, then paused. For what it's worth. Sometimes the best revenge is just stepping out of the blast radius. I thought about that after he left, about how I'd been so carefully distant from my father's empire, never taking his money, never joining his board, never letting my name appear on anything that could tie me to his methods. I'd thought I was being idealistic. Maybe I'd just been smart. The cracks widened. A major donor withdrew support. Then another. The foundation's gala, an annual event that usually raised millions, was postponed indefinitely. My father's other businesses started showing strain too. Not collapse, but stress. Partnerships becoming careful. Calls not being returned as quickly. Reputation, I'd learned in business school, was a leveraged asset. It magnified success, but also amplified failure. And my father had leveraged his reputation everywhere. I saw Elena one afternoon by accident coming out of a law office downtown. She looked smaller somehow, though she was wearing another expensive outfit. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. But there was something haunted in the way she moved, like she was constantly aware of being watched. She saw me across the street. Froze. For a moment we just stood there, separated by traffic and 6 months and a choice that had seemed so clear to her once. She started to cross toward me. I could have walked away, probably should have, but I stayed, curious what desperation looked like when it wore designer clothes. "Please," she said when she reached me. "Can we talk? Just 5 minutes." "Here." I gestured to the busy sidewalk. "Anywhere. I don't care." Her voice cracked slightly. "I need to explain." "You explained already. At dinner. Very clearly." "That's not fair. You don't understand what it's like." She stopped herself, realized how that sounded. "The foundation is falling apart. Your father he's blaming me, saying I brought instability, that the optics of our situation made everything worse. Our situation, as if it were a joint venture rather than her choice. I'm sorry you're experiencing consequences, I said quietly. I really am. Don't do that. Her eyes flashed with something like her old fire. Don't act like you're above this. Like you didn't want this to happen. I didn't make your choices, Elena. I didn't structure the foundation. I didn't decide who to become when money was offered. I loved you. Present tense now. Desperate. You loved the idea of never struggling, I corrected gently. There's a difference. A cab pulled up behind her, someone getting out. The city moved around us like we were stones in a river. She looked so tired. He calls you, she said suddenly. Your father. He won't admit it, but I've seen him staring at his phone, waiting for you to call back. I know. Doesn't that matter to you? That she searched for the word, hurting. I thought about the dinner table, about watching her hand let go of mine under the mahogany surface, about every choice that had led to this moment. Yes, I said finally, it matters, just not enough. I walked away before she could respond. Behind me, I heard her say my name once, softly like a prayer or an epitaph. I didn't turn around. That night, alone in my studio, I received an email from Robertson. Simple subject line, conversation. The message was brief. He'd been following the foundation situation, had questions about governance structures and family dynamics, wondered if I'd be willing to consult off the record. Compensation negotiable. I stared at the email for a long time. This was the moment, the door opening to my father's world, but on my terms, not as a supplicant or a son, but as someone with expertise they needed. I typed a short reply agreeing to meet, then sat back and looked at my reflection in the darkened window, somewhere across town, in that lit-up estate, with its perfect grounds. My father and Elena were probably having their own conversations, assigning blame, calculating costs, wondering where I was and what I knew and whether I'd be the solution or another problem. They'd taught me to think strategically, to understand that love without leverage was just vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Now they get to learn what I'd built from those lessons. The meeting with Robert Chun led to another meeting, which led to a consultation contract, which led to me sitting in a conference room 3 blocks from my father's main office, reviewing the foundation's financial architecture like a surgeon examining a patient I'd once known intimately. Robert was direct in a way my father never had been. The structure's solid, he said, spreading documents across the table. But the optics are poison. Every decision your father made looks suspicious now, even the legitimate ones. And the board. He trailed off delicately. You mean Elena, I said. I mean the optics of nepotistic appointments. Her qualifications are adequate, but the timeline of her hiring, combined with her prior relationship with the family. He cleared his throat. It looks like exactly what it was. A transaction. I wouldn't have phrased it that way. But that's what you mean. Robert studied me carefully. You're very calm about this. I've had time to process. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been processing for months. That every document he showed me was one I'd already reviewed in public filings, every vulnerability one I'd already identified. I wasn't helping them fix the foundation. I was watching them discover what I'd known all along. The real confrontation came 2 weeks later. My father requested a meeting. Not through a call, he'd stopped trying those, but through his attorney, formal and cold. Family matter requiring discussion. His office, Thursday at 2. I almost declined, but curiosity won out. Or maybe it was something deeper. The need to see him in his diminished state, to know if the man who'd taught me that love was a bargaining chip had learned anything from his own losses. His office hadn't changed. Same leather chairs, same view of the city, same photographs of powerful people shaking his hand at events that cost more per plate than most people earned in a month. But he looked different, older. The kind of aging that happens from the inside out, when confidence starts to leak through cracks you didn't know existed. Elena was there too. I should have expected that, but it still caught me off guard. The two of them together, united by their shared mistakes and mounting consequences. Thank you for coming, my father said, gesturing to a chair. The politeness was new, unsettling. I sat but didn't speak. Let the silence work for me. I assume Robert has briefed you on the situation, he continued. The Foundation review, the media attention. It's complicated. It's actually quite simple, I replied. Questionable practices met scrutiny. That's how accountability works. Something flashed in his eyes, anger, maybe, or recognition that I'd stopped speaking his language of euphemisms. Elena shifted in her chair. She looked like she hadn't slept well in weeks. We're trying to fix this, she said quietly. Make things right. By asking me to help? I kept my voice level, almost gentle. That's interesting timing. 6 months ago, I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand how the world worked. Now, I'm suddenly valuable. You're my son, my father said, and there was something raw in his voice that I'd never heard before. Whatever else has happened, that hasn't changed. No, I agreed. What's changed is that being your son used to feel like a deficiency. Now, it looks like an asset you need. The words landed hard. I watched him absorb them. Watched Elena's hand move toward his arm in a gesture of support that seemed more reflexive than genuine. I made mistakes, he said finally. The admission clearly cost him. With the Foundation. With other things. But I built something that matters. Organizations that do real good. I can't let it all collapse because of optics and timing and the consequences of treating people like investments. I finished. The silence that followed was dense enough to drown in. Elena stood, abruptly. I'm going to give you some privacy. She moved toward the door, then paused near my chair. For what it's worth, she said, so quietly only I could hear, I never stopped missing you. You miss who you were when we were together, I replied just as quietly. That's not the same thing. She left without responding. My father waited until the door closed, then stood and walked to the window. His posture was different than I remembered, less commanding, more careful. Robert says you've been helpful, that you understand the structures better than most of our consultants. I studied your methods, I said. Turns out they're very teachable. Then you understand what's at stake, not just for me, but for the people who depend on the Foundation, the programs we fund, the organizations that trusted you to be better than you were? He turned from the window. You're angry. You have every right to be. What happened with Elena wasn't an accident. I interrupted. You saw someone I loved, and you tested her. Like you've tested everyone your whole life. Like affection is just another commodity to price and purchase. She made her choice. After you made her an offer she couldn't refuse. There's a difference between choosing and being given impossible options. I stood, met his eyes, but that's the thing about tests, Father. They reveal the tester as much as the tested. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the city continued its indifferent machinery. Somewhere in this building, Elena was probably sitting alone, wondering if she'd traded the right person for the wrong empire. What do you want? My father asked finally. The question of a man used to negotiation, to finding everyone's price. I thought about the cramped apartment, the dreams Elena and I had built in poverty and hope. Thought about this office, this view, this entire world that had seemed so important until I'd learned what it cost to maintain. I want you to understand something, I said quietly. You both taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. You showed me that dignity isn't something people can give you or take away. It's something you choose every day, in every decision about who you're willing to become. That's not an answer. Yes, it is. I moved toward the door. I'll finish the consultation work for Robert. I'll help stabilize what can be stabilized, but not for you. For the people who actually depend on the Foundation's work. The ones who didn't choose to be caught in your architecture. And then, I paused at the door, looked back at him. Then I disappear again. Back to my life, my work, my choices. You get to keep your empire, what's left of it, and I get to keep something more valuable, which is the certainty that I'll never become you. The words weren't cruel. They were simply true, and truth, I'd learned, was the sharpest tool I possessed. I left him standing at that window, backlit by his view of a city that had already started forgetting his name. In the elevator down, I caught my reflection in the polished brass, and for the first time in months, I recognized the person looking back. Not broken, not bitter, just finished with needing their approval. The foundation survived, barely. I spent 6 weeks restructuring their governance protocols, implementing oversight mechanisms, recommending board changes that Robert Chen presented as his own ideas. My name never appeared on any documents. I made sure of that. This wasn't about credit. It was about ensuring that the programs helping actual people didn't collapse because my father had confused legacy with ownership. Elena resigned from the board 3 weeks into the process. The official statement cited personal reasons and pursuing other opportunities. The truth was simpler. She'd become a liability, and my father had finally learned to cut losses. I heard about it from Robert, not from either of them. The real shift came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after the confrontation in my father's office. I was at the university library when Elena appeared at my table. I hadn't seen her since that day in his office. She looked different, lighter somehow, despite the obvious weight of whatever had brought her here. "I know you probably don't want to see me," she said, not sitting. "But I needed to tell you something before I leave." "Leave?" "Chicago. I got a position at a small gallery. Real work this time, not—" She gestured vaguely. "Not whatever that was." I closed my laptop. "I'm glad you found something legitimate." "Don't do that. Don't be kind. I don't deserve it." "Probably not," I agreed, "but I'm not being kind for you." She finally sat, perched on the edge of the chair, like she might need a run. "Your father and I aren't speaking. He blames me for the foundation problems. I blame him for everything else. We're both probably right. Probably. I loved you. I need you to know that. Before the money, before your father, before everything got complicated, I loved you. I know. But it wasn't enough." "No," I said quietly. "It wasn't. Not against the fear of struggling. Not against the promise of never being powerless again." She nodded, accepting the truth of it. For what it's worth, I learned something too. That security isn't the same as safety, and that the most expensive things are sometimes the ones that cost you everything. We sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by students who had no idea they were witnessing an epilogue. "Will you be okay?" I asked. "I think so. It's smaller, quieter. Nobody knows my story there." She stood. I wanted to apologize, but I realize now that's not really what this is. It's more like saying goodbye to who I was, who we were. "Then goodbye," I said, not unkindly. She left without looking back. The next contact with my father came through his attorney 2 weeks later. A formal letter on expensive stationery proposing a trust fund. A gesture of reconciliation. No strings attached. I read it twice, then called the attorney directly. "Tell him no," I said. "Mr. Whitmore anticipated you might refuse. He's prepared to negotiate terms." There are no terms that would change my answer. I don't want his money. I never did. May I ask why? Because the moment I accept it, I become part of his architecture again, and I've worked too hard building my own. My father tried one more time, 3 months later. Not through lawyers, but in person. He appeared at my thesis defense, sat in the back row, watching me present my research on ethical governance in family foundations. When it was over, he approached slowly. "You used my foundation as your case study," he said. "I used the public record of a foundation that failed its mission. I corrected. If that happens to be yours, that's not my fault." "Fair enough." He looked older but steadier somehow. Less polished, more real. "I've thought about what you said. About dignity. About what people become when they confuse power with worth. And you were right." He met my eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that you taught me something I spent 70 years avoiding, which is that the people who walk away are sometimes the strongest ones in the room." Something in my chest loosened slightly. Not forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, might never be, but acknowledgement that he'd finally understood the cost of his methods. "I hope you figure out what matters," I said, "before you run out of time to care." He nodded once, then walked away. I watched him go, this man who'd shaped so much of my life through absence and transaction, and felt only a quiet sort of peace. He'd wanted an heir to continue his legacy. Instead, he'd created someone who understood his methods well enough to reject them entirely. I graduated 2 weeks later. My thesis was published by an academic journal, sparked some small conversations in nonprofit governance circles. Robert Chin offered me a position at his firm, substantial salary, corner office trajectory, everything my father would have considered success. I declined and took a teaching position instead, assistant professor at a state college 2 hours north, working with students who reminded me of who I'd been, hungry, uncertain, trying to figure out if integrity was compatible with survival. The pay was modest. The office was small. The work was real. I moved into a house near campus, nothing grand but mine. There was a porch where I could sit in the evenings and watch the neighborhood kids play basketball in driveways, their laughter uncomplicated by the weight of inheritance or expectation. I planted a garden in the backyard, tomatoes, herbs, things that required patience and care but couldn't be bought. My father sent one letter after I moved, not asking for anything, just updating me on the foundation's progress. They'd implemented every recommendation I'd made. The programs were stabilizing. He'd stepped back from daily operations, was considering full retirement. You were right about most things, he wrote in closing. I spent my life building monuments when I should have been building relationships. By the time I understood the difference, the people who mattered had already learned to live without me. I read it twice, then filed it away. Not with anger, not with triumph. Just acknowledgement that some lessons come too late to change their outcomes. Elena sent one postcard from Chicago, a photograph of the gallery where she worked, small, independent, nothing like the grand spaces she used to dream about in my father's orbit. Thank you. Honestly. 3 words that contained an entire education. I didn't respond, but I kept it pinned to my office bulletin board, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that people were capable of learning, even when the lesson cost them everything they thought they wanted. Life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known existed. Teaching classes, mentoring students, writing papers that mattered to the 6 people who read them. I dated occasionally a librarian, then a lawyer from the next town over, but nothing serious. I wasn't avoiding connection. I just learned to recognize the difference between loneliness and the need to be alone long enough to remember who you were. One evening, almost a year after graduation, I was grading papers on my porch when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Is this Professor Whitmore? A woman's voice, uncertain. Speaking. My name is Angela Torres. I'm a graduate student at the university where your father's foundation is based. I'm researching your thesis, the one on governance failures. I was hoping I could ask you some questions. We talked for an hour. She was sharp, passionate about nonprofit reform, completely unaware of my connection to the case study I'd written about. When I finally told her, there was a long silence. So, you weren't just theorizing, she said quietly. You were surviving. Both, I replied. Turns out they're not mutually exclusive. She thanked me, asked if she could cite our conversation in her own research. I agreed, and after we hung up, I sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and violet. Somewhere, students like Angela were learning from failures that had once felt personal and devastating. Somewhere, the foundation was doing actual good work because I'd understood its architecture well enough to fix it. And somewhere, my father and Elena were living with the consequences of choices that had seemed so certain at the time. I thought about that dinner, the one where everything shattered, and realized I couldn't remember the exact words anymore. The anger had faded into something quieter, understanding, maybe, or just acceptance that people reveal themselves when tested, and sometimes the revelation is simply that they were always going to choose the path that required less courage. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, my old study partner, sending a photo of his daughter's graduation. She's going to law school. Says you inspired her. Thank you, brother. I smiled, typed back congratulations, then set the phone aside. This was the revenge my father and Elena never understood. Not destruction, not vindication, not watching them suffer. Just this, the quiet certainty of having built a life they couldn't touch, couldn't buy, couldn't diminish with their choices. I'd lost the relationship, lost access to wealth and status, and everything they'd valued more than what we'd had. And in losing it, I'd found something they'd never possess. The knowledge that I could look at my reflection and recognize the person staring back. That I'd chosen dignity over comfort, truth over convenience, and somehow, despite everything, that choice had been enough. Not perfect, not painless, but enough. The sun finished setting. The neighborhood kids went inside for dinner. I gathered my papers and went inside, too, to the home I'd built without anyone's permission, in the life I'd chosen without anyone's approval. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like the only victory that mattered.